there I get 190 divided by 190 divided by 2. If I take the seconds up, if I take seconds per frame up top, I get frames per second. This frame cancels with that frame, and I get times 10 to the 3 bits per second per user. So this is 190 divided by 2, which is 95 times 10 to the 3rd bits per second per user. What I also could have done is I could have taken my previous result, which was 950 kilobits. So this is 95 kilobits per second per user. I could have taken my previous result, which was 950 bits per second, and divided by the number of users, which is 10, and I would have gotten the same result. So these problems generally tend to come down to unit analysis. If you know how your units are operating, you can usually figure out the right answer. So for instance, if you have a bit rate of bits per second and a number of users, and you want to know bits per second per user, you can usually just divide by the number of users. Or if you have bits per second, if you have number of users and bits per second per user, and you want to know the peak bit rate, you can usually do the unit analysis to find out what you need. Okay, just as a more practical example, I had a question about where these things are used. So I'd just like to give you a practical example. So, the GSM mobile telephone standard. So if you have a cell phone with Rogers or Fido, that cell phone runs on GSM. So, and I think GSM has really internationally won the day as far as standards are concerned. And I think I've heard that Telus and Bell are both converting to GSM as well. So this is the most widely used mobile telephone standard in the world, and it uses both FDMA and CDMA. Excuse me, FDMA and TDMA. So, there's an awful lot of details. There are multiple frequency bands in which these operate, but just as one example, there is something called GSM 900, which occupies the wireless frequency band from 890 to 915 megahertz, and 935 to 960 megahertz. One of these bands, so when you have a cell phone call, you have an uplink and a downlink. In other words, a telephone link for you to talk and a telephone link for you to listen. I can't remember which is which, but I'm pretty sure this is the uplink. In other words, you talking into the cell phone, and I'm pretty sure this is the downlink, which is you listening. So here we have 25 megahertz. Let's just take this frequency band as an example. Oh yeah, that's true, I have it right here. This is the uplink, and this is the downlink. So let's take this as an example, 25 megahertz. What we do is we first divide it with FDMA. We divide it into 200 kilohertz chunks. So in 25 megahertz, how many 200 kilohertz chunks are there? Let's make this...
150.
No.
125.
Close though, 125.
Okay,
Off by 5%. So there's 125 channels. It turns out one of them is unused. So actually, I don't know if they use it for control or something else, or if it's just left unused, but in practice, only 124 of these are used. So, what will happen is you press send on your cell phone to set up a call. You get one uplink and one downlink channel. So one of these 200 kilohertz channels is assigned to the uplink, and one of them is assigned to the downlink. Okay, now 200 kilohertz is an awful lot of bandwidth for just a cell phone call. Cell phone calls generally, the GSM standard, under the GSM standard, we generally get around 25 kilobits per second per user. So that's an awful lot of bandwidth for 25 kilobits per second. So what we do is in each FDMA slot, we subdivide it with TDMA. In TDMA, we have each frame. A frame lasts 4.615 milliseconds and contains 8 users. Or contains 8 slots. In other words, we take this 200 kilohertz chunk and further subdivide it by 8 users. So how many users can we pack into this system? Basically, it's 124, excuse me, times 8, which is just under 1,000. So in GSM 900, we can pack, we can basically have 1,000 phone calls going on at the same time. Just a few other details in case you're interested. The guard time here is 30.5 microseconds. So in order to get, we could do the same analysis and get the peak bit rate per user. It'll turn out that a couple interesting things here, just as side notes. It turns out that the peak bit rate is around, using the modulation scheme that they use in GSM, is around 271 kilobits per second. So we've said that bandwidth is roughly equal. So if you, I've said bandwidth is roughly equal to 2 over time per bit. So in other words, 1 over time per bit is equal to the bit rate. So in other words, if I transmit, if every microsecond I transmit a bit, 1 over that is my bit rate. 1 over 1 microsecond would be 10 to the 6th bits per second. So I'm basically saying that my bit rate, if I take that over, is equal to bandwidth over 2. So under that analysis, what I'd be saying here is that the bit rate is 200 over 2, which is about 100 kilobits per second. So what do you think is going on over here that they get slightly more than twice that bit rate? This is assuming binary. What might be going on over there?
Use a higher encoding.
Use a higher modulation scheme. So it turns out they use 4 area. So that accounts for about, that would boost you back up to about 200 kilobits per second. This is also not a hard and fast, this is not scientific, this is just a little rule of thumb that I'm using. Where they squeeze out the extra is using a clever modulation scheme that we won't talk about called GMSK. In GMSK, I won't even get into it, but it's cleverly arranged so as to compact the bandwidth as much as possible.